Welcome to the panel room and welcome to QED, of course. My name is Andy Wilson. I'm a co-organiser for this event, occasional host of the Incredulous podcast and intrepid self-proclaimed DNA detective. And I'm also your chair for this panel, Who's Your Daddy? It's been 4 years since we last had a QED. Having fun? Yay! Determined group. Now, in this panel, we'll be talking about the science, ethics, and human impact of at-home DNA testing. It's kind of going to be in those three sections. Think Ancestry.com, MyHeritage DNA, 23andMe. With these services, which are readily available, one can just swab a cheek or spit in a cup, and a DNA analysis is completed on your sample, and then there's software tools available to map your DNA to possible relatives or characteristics, which we'll hear more about, which can be identified to claim to be health markers. We'll talk about that. So joining us on our quest for the best available version of the truth about at-home DNA testing are three amazing panellists, so I'll ask to introduce themselves now. Anna, can we start there and just work our way through the panel?
I'm Adam Rutherford, and I'm a geneticist, so possibly qualified to be on this panel.
And is it true or not that you've probably blown most of the content for this on your main stage tour?
Is that a euphemism? No. Cornflake. I mean, bearing in mind what I was talking about, it might well be perceived as such. No. So I've written several books about the history of genetics and the current understanding of genetics, and a big part of my work is in the criticism of direct-to-consumer genetic tests, because, and this is my sort of setup, my provocation is that I think that on the whole, they contribute negatively to the public understanding of genetics.
Cool. Thank you, Adam. Penny.
Hi, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. My name's Dr. Penny Walters. I live in Bristol. I'm a lecturer at Bath Spa University. That one person. I was adopted, and after I had my first baby, who was my first relative in the universe when I was age 25, I began wondering about my biological tree. So my input today is going to be looking at the sheer joy and excitement of doing your family tree. I've written a book called The Psychology of Searching. However, many ethical dilemmas ensue, and you can uncover drastically other people's secrets and lies, and maybe you need to be careful what your secrets and lies are in 50 years. So those are my two contributions.
Awesome, thank you. Jonathan?
Is this on? Yeah, it is on. Hello, I'm Jonathan. So I'm a science communicator at McGill University's Office for Science and Society. My own background is in molecular biology and human genetics, and I have not written a book.
Yet.
It's a threat.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. So just before we get started, I've got a couple of questions for the audience by show of hands, please. First question, could you indicate if you have ever taken a DNA test at home for any reason? Wow, quite a few of you. Yeah, okay. Put your hands down, please. Hands up or indicate if you took your DNA for genealogy reasons. Thank you. Put it down.
Well, I mean, for professional reasons.
Professional reasons, yeah. And finally, put your hands up if you did it to get a heads up on medical issues. A couple of you, yeah. Okay. Just one final one. If you did it because you want to find out if you're a murderer, please put your hand up. Okay, Cleo. Thank you, Cleo. You can always rely on Cleo. Okay, so just so everyone knows, we will be mentioning murder later, but not in a detailed way, and there'll also be a mention of sexual assault later, but again, not in depth, with no detail whatsoever. So let's get going. Now, if you've read the description on this panel, you'll already know that 4 years ago, I took a DNA test with Ancestry.com in an attempt to identify my father. I'm 56 years old, and just so we're clear, when I do refer to my father's side of the family, I'll change their names. When I was 13, my mother took me to one side, away from my older brother and sister. She told me that I had a different father to them. I was the result of a one-night stand and a burst condom. Somebody tittered, definitely. I reacted pretty well, I think, considering I was only 13, to the news that I was, as I perceived at the time, a bit less of a brother than I was previously. But it did bother me a lot. and it irked me. And for the full story, you can listen to episode 264 of Skeptics with a K. In any case, I've always wanted to know who the spermicidal maniac was, and whether indeed I had the full story. So fast forward to 4 years ago, I did a DNA test. Following that, I built my family tree, and for the first time in my life, identified family members who were clearly not from my mum's side. Within 6 months, I felt as though my father could be only one of 5 people, and only one of those was called Peter. My mum had said his name was Peter, not his true name. Certainty was my goal, and in that pursuit, I contacted him, explaining that he may be my father, and could we meet, maybe do a DNA test. His response was to deny it, and he stopped communicating with me. He's currently 82 years old. I've met Peter's sister, who refused to do a DNA test. I've also spoken with 2 previously unknown brothers, also have refused to do a DNA test. And I'll tell a bit more of the story later, but at this point in my story, I'm about 80% confident that I know who my father is. So our first section in this panel is to discuss how DNA genealogy works and perhaps how it doesn't. And for that, I'm going to go to Adam. Could you just talk us through how they use DNA to figure these relationships out, please?
Yeah. So it's all predicated on a single obvious fact, which is that everyone in history has had 2 parents, right? With the possible exception of Jesus. That's one of my things that I say, and I figured I could get away with it in this audience. Anyway, so you inherit half of your genome from your mother, your biological mother, and half of your genome from your biological father. And that is why you're more similar to your immediate family than you are to random strangers, right? So it's a reshuffled. What you get is a shuffled version of their genome. But now that we can sequence DNA relatively easily and relatively cheaply, we can compare any 2 individuals' DNA and look for similarities between them, and then we make statistical inferences that basically say that we can establish relationships between them. So because you share 50% of your DNA from your mother and your father, that's an easy relation to establish. You also share 50% of your DNA with any siblings. Well, there's a different 50% for each sibling, and so we can establish with great certainty a sibling, a brother or a sister. And the same is for first cousins, and the same is for second cousins. But then relatedness sort of drops off a cliff. And the fact of the matter is, because of the way genealogies actually work, rather than how we think they work in a sort of who do you think you are type way, well, you go back through time and you identify an ancestor who inevitably, if they're a woman, they were probably a chambermaid, and if they were a man, they were either a duke or a murderer, because that's the narrative that we like to tell. But what it does, what those very nice, interesting stories don't do, is reveal that the number of ancestors you have doubles every generation back. So 5 generations back, your great-great-great-great-grandparent, you have 5 to the power of n ancestors, which is 32?
Sure.
Yeah. I went to bed quite late last night. And so what we do in genealogy is we tend to identify, because most people pass through history without leaving much of a trace, but what we do in genealogy is we identify people that we can identify, and we've got a very strong tendency to ignore the rest of them. So genetic genealogy and genealogy also diverge as you go back through time, right? Which is a sort of artifact of the way sperm and egg are actually produced. If you go back 11 generations, you carry DNA from less than half of your actual ancestors. So I'll stop there. But basically, it's incredibly good at identifying close family relationships like siblings, parents. But beyond a certain relatedness, it becomes a very generic tool. And the fact of the matter is that pretty much everyone in this room is probably a 4th or 5th cousin.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Adam. I'm just going to tweet out a chart that can be used to visualise what Adam was just talking about. So that's gone if you look up the QEDcon account. Penny, could you just, after Adam's explanation, just talk about when you're building the family tree out, Adam's already talked about how when you go away a certain distance, it becomes more difficult to be reliable information. So what are the common errors people make when they're building their family trees using DNA in these websites?
Well, some people know their family tree and quite confidently fill in the information about parents, grandparents, great-grandparents. So if you're fragmented in any way, or there have been any errors, or a couple of got a bit confused together. There's quite a lot of clerical errors in trees, but whenever we see the information online, we seem to think that it's true. So the biggest error with online trees is that you get a hint that you might be related to blah blah great uncle, and it looks and sounds right, so you add that information in. The more common your surname is, the more common those errors would be.
Yeah.
But so for example, my biological mother's family were from South Wales, and so therefore many people would have similar names, and it would take a lot of detective work to work out who's the right person to put in your tree. So what I've enjoyed with the errors is that you can super sleuth with kind of double negatives into what's correct, because if you've got somebody in your DNA matching who you can slot into your tree, that person can become an anchor point.
Right.
So, for example, if I'm related to this man here, and he's got a good trail of evidence with his tree, I can then add that branch to my tree. And then if I'm related to this person and I'm related to this person, but they're not, I've got X amount of other ancestors that I can investigate. So the biggest problem with online trees is people get overexcited and just add somebody with a similar surname.
Yeah. So it would be fair, given your comments there and what Adam was talking about, and the further away you get from a direct relationship, you need more and more evidence to justify adding them to and that's usually documentary evidence, isn't it? Or spoken word evidence, because people are alive
Yes.
and so on. Yeah.
So my first major anchor point was my DNA was coming up as half Irish, half Welsh ethnicity. So I didn't understand that initially because I've never been to Ireland. So a lot of us, when we do a DNA test, it's just cute. Let's find this ethnicity, and this is cute. I couldn't understand, where did Irish come from? I've never been there. So I've had to really research it over the last few years. But my major anchor point was a man in America whose grandfather had got a paper pedigree from that grandfather's grandmother.
Yeah.
So this was literally, this person had given this information to their child, who gave that information to their child. So there were 4 lines in that pedigree. As soon as I put that man's evidence in my tree, I then could use him as a kind of anchor point to measure, do people relate to him or not. If they do relate to him, they've got to go down that branch, and if they don't relate to him, I've got another 31 or however many opportunities to look for.
Well, I was certainly click happy when I started. You get these hints through on the system, and the criteria they use are very dodgy and thin, wafer thin in some cases. Now, for Jonathan, it's different because Adam, Penny, myself, we've spent quite a lot of time, either amateur or professionally, digging into these things. Jonathan hasn't. Are you remotely interested, Jonathan?
I feel like I'm being put on the spot here. There's a huge spotlight right on me, right?
Yeah.
I find the whole ancestry question interesting because I have very little interest in it.
Yeah.
And perhaps if I were...
Welcome to the panel.
Perhaps if I were adopted, that I would feel this yearning to go back and figure out who my biological father, for example, was. But as far as I know, I'm not adopted. And the way that I've internalized it, that I think about this, is that my ancestors don't define who I am. I mean, obviously, there's genetic material that I've inherited, and there are some, inherited risk factors, for example. But beyond that, the person that I choose to be, the actions that I take, are not dictated by who my ancestors are.
It's interesting because I feel... was that a round of applause for Jonathan? Yeah. You do you, Jonathan. It's interesting for me because despite the fact that I've never had a relationship with this person, I feel somewhat compelled about it. Does anybody relate to what I'm saying there? Yeah, only a couple of you. Wow.
Yeah,
They clap for me, Andy.
Yeah, they like you, don't they? All right. So,
I think it depends what you find, because I'm just Mrs. English wandering around, Mrs. English, and then I couldn't work out why my Irish ancestors had moved to Wales. What were they doing? So a friend of mine said, Penny, they didn't move from the south of Ireland to go and work in coal mines. They were fleeing a potato famine. So I was devastated on many levels. Firstly, where were you in that history lesson? And secondly, fleeing a famine. I've never even been hungry. What on earth were my ancestors going through?
As far as I understand it, that's how mine ended up over here
If
as
you've
well.
got suffragettes or war heroes or people that have desperately struggled, my children, for example, are mixed race. Their DNA isn't Jamaican, it's Nigerian. So this is revealing enslaved ancestors who, for a variety of terrible situations, including no names on censuses, they've been forgotten. We haven't got their names. In a million years, you'll never get their names, but we've got them in our blood. And so for me, differently, which is interesting, I'm really, really interested in my ancestors' narrative adding to my identity.
Okay.
So, so it's interesting to have two completely different opinions.
Well, I'm midway between the two. I'm the third way in that, because I think that I agree with Jonathan that I think that one of the mistakes people make is to assume that we inherit behaviours from our ancestors, which is simply not the case at all, either genetically or psychologically. But on the other hand, as humans, we have a great desire for narrative satisfaction.
Yeah.
And this is a way for us to understand history, which is very personalised. And so when we moved away in the 1960s, 70s, 80s from the sort of great man theory of history, where we tell history through the actions of men only, and moved to a more family-based, bottom-up approach to history, this is a new way of engaging with understanding history. And when you do have ancestors who were enslaved, as I am the same. So the Indian side of my family come from indentured slaves from India. Now, that doesn't have I don't identify as a Guyanese Indian because I was born in Ipswich, right? And I don't have any affinity to those my ancestors who were indentured. But it's still interesting. It's a good story. I'll just tell a very, very quick one, if I may, and then I'll shut up for the rest of the panel.
Does it have to do with cornflakes?
No, it doesn't.
We're all disturbed.
I'm sorry about that. I just ruined cornflakes for 500 people. They are disgusting. Sorry. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah. I say, so on my dad's side of my family, he's from the northeast. Was born in Yorkshire. We've got a cousin who's done a lot of genealogy and done it pretty successfully to the point where we've established that some of my great-great-great-great-grandfather was a man called Benjamin Handy, who ran a travelling circus, very successful travelling circus in the late 18th, early 19th century. And they found his records, and circus history is a really interesting bit of history, and there's lots of documentation for it. Anyway, Benjamin Handy imported a man called Neil Huntley from a Catawba indigenous tribe in America, and he was known as the world's greatest horse jumper, right, which is jumping from horse to horse, right? Yeah. And Neil Huntley, that was his westernized name, was imported, joined Handy's travelling circus, and his daughter, Mary Huntley, married Benjamin. And she is my great-great-great-whatever grandmother. And we've got the marriage certificate, Covent Garden, 1818. It says Savage on it, okay? Now, that's a cool story, right? I'm descended from Native Americans as well as indentured slaves. Does it mean anything? Absolutely not.
No.
Does it have any bearing on my existence? No, it's a cool story. It's an interesting piece of history. Do I feel affinity to the Catawba or any indigenous Americans? Of course not. Okay. And it was ironic that we discovered this at exactly the time when Elizabeth Warren discovered exactly the same thing and claimed it. And so I think that the history is interesting, but what it tells us about ourselves is close to zero.
Okay, thank you. Adam, staying with you for a moment, according to Ancestry's database, I'm 49% Irish, 24% English, and Northwestern Europe, 16% Scottish, 7% Swedish, and 4% Welsh. Hey. Let's take a random topic, say arguing with a racist. How likely is it that they would find an ethnicity surprise in their DNA, and would it be reliable enough for me to smugly score a point against them?
So I spend quite a lot of time on white supremacist websites and in chat rooms.
Okay.
Now, I do this so that you don't have to. But
Do you vet your panelists, Sandy? Do you vet them?
Jonathan doesn't care about his family, and Annalie's on racist websites. Brilliant. Penny, what are you going to reveal?
You'll be surprised.
Yeah. And so the reason there is a specific reason for this, which is that white supremacists in America are particularly obsessed with the concept of racial purity. I talked about it a bit in the talk I gave just a minute ago. And with the advent of genetic genealogy tests, an interesting phenomenon emerged, which is if you spend time on places like 4chan and 8chan and Stormfront and those white supremacist websites, which I do, we started noticing about 10 years ago that many white supremacists were using ancestry tests in order to demonstrate their racial purity and therefore membership to their tribe. But what we also started noticing is a small proportion of them were doing these tests and discovering that they had ancestry from people whom they hate.
Yeah.
And that's been documented, and there's an academic paper, which I talk about a lot in my work, 3,000, I think it's something like 3,000 case studies where people have revealed that they've got Jewish or recent diasporic African or Middle Eastern ancestry. And they documented in this study, which was by Donovan and someone
Et al.
Kellogg.
Yeah. Aaron Panofsky. They documented the responses and they categorized them in 5. There were 5 types of responses. Interestingly, none of them were, oh, maybe I shouldn't be a massive racist at this point. But this relates to the discussion that's going on now, which is about disinformation and misinformation and conspiracy theories, which we're not in because we're here. But that of those responses, the first most popular one was try a different test. Right?
The test is wrong.
Now, actually, you laugh at this, but that actually is not unreasonable because the tests do use, different companies use different panels.
They do,
and
yeah.
they're coalescing on a much more robust, 23andMe uses something like 700,000 markers now. But a few years ago, I did it. I did one test which said I had ginger hair, and I did another test which said that I didn't. Weirdly, I knew the answer to that question already. So answer 1 was do another test. Answer 2, 23andMe is run by Jews. Do another test.
Oh my God.
3, 23andMe is run by Jews who deliberately sow misinformation into their results. Do another test. And then the 4th one, I always pick out a particular example, not just a sort of generic example, because and this really typifies the lack of logical, clear thinking that goes into having this form of bigotry. Because there was one response which said, from a guy who discovered that he had Jewish ancestry, and the response said, when you look in the mirror, do you see a Jew? If not, it's all good. And I thought, well, what's the point in doing the fucking test in the first place? If you can just decide your ethnicity, anyway. I don't want to disparage the tests, right? No. Too much. This is an extreme fringe version. I do think that these tests contribute to a form of genetic determinism which is based on national stereotypes. Mm-hmm. And I think it's a thing that we've been fighting against in academic genetics for the last 30 or 40 years, because most people do these tests and then they say things like, I'm 39% whatever, and that is why I'm, some attribute for that country. It isn't possible to be 39% Spanish or 45% whatever it was, Irish, that you said. That is not a thing that's possible to be, because Irishness is determined by your passport and where you were born and your citizenship, and DNA does not correspond to national boundaries.
Yeah. It's genetic astrology, isn't it?
That term was coined by my colleague.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Mark Thomas. Yeah, but yes, it's good.
Great minds think alike.
I completely agree.
I was planning to use it a bit later in my notes, but it's fine. Penny, did you have any comment? I'm going to go to the audience in a moment. We'll take 2 questions from the audience before we change topic a little bit.
Do we bounce them?
But I'm going to need that catch box.
Oh, do you want me to do this?
Penny, did you have any final comments to add there?
I think that ethnicity really, really does affect your identity. I've got 6 mixed-race children, and if each of them looked in the mirror, one might say he's English, one might say he's Black British, one might say he's mixed race, another might say he's African, another one might say, I hate these labels, do not involve me with this labelling. And we've got varieties of things in there. So when I look in the mirror, I am English, but I've got a very hidden history. And I really have to acknowledge, admire the adversity that those people went through, because I've just been floating around. I've had people fleeing a famine. My children have had people enslaved. You know, you have to recognise those people's contribution. So as a mother, my children, to some extent, have to be grateful for all of the things that I've done for them. I have to be grateful to what my parents have done for me. And therefore, for me, understanding your heritage or your ancestry, let alone your race, is actually crucial for you understanding who you are. Because, for example, in Bristol, when the Colston statue came down, the city was completely divided, and race is it's a very electric topic for you to be discussing. But for me, perhaps differently for other people, it's been very, very important.
Excellent.
And it's the lost ancestors, completely lost. I've got friends that have found 12% Nigerian. Well, it's blatantly obvious where that has come from. So I've equally got African American friends that have got 6 or whatever percent German or Dutch. Well, it's equally obvious where that's come from. Mm. So these are all our ingredients in our cake, and it might be icing on the cake in that sense, because you might want to argue that genealogy is quite a middle class luxury, really. My ancestors would have been toiling in a field. They wouldn't have had time for this.
It's an interesting analogy, the baked cake idea, because some people just enjoy the cake. Some people want to know how it was made, right?
Yeah.
Ed, can you turn on the catch box, please? Britt, speak into the thing. Put it very close to your mask.
Okay. Hi. I'm curious about your opinions on the ethics of using these tests. For example, is it ethical or appropriate to use information from these tests, say, for example, when applying to college?
Britt, I don't mean to run all over you, but we're doing ethics next, so we'll see about that afterward. Sorry, genealogy, please. Who's got a question about genealogy first? Okay. Sorry, Britt.
Hello. So if you take a test and it shows you're, 30% white, 20% Irish, 1% Martian or whatever, how seriously do you take that information and what do you do with it?
Okay. Adam?
What, me personally?
Well, anyone.
Well, nothing really. I mean, I think what Penny was just saying is true, right? Identity is important. And, for me, who spent a career explaining why race is not a biologically meaningful construct, that isn't the same as saying that race doesn't exist, and it's not the same as saying that race is important. So, for example, the African American genome is a complex mixture that doesn't represent any other group of people on Earth because of transatlantic slavery, and indeed up to 20% of the average African American has European ancestry. So, from a genetic point of view, the African American genome is not a coherent thing. But that's not me sitting here saying African American people don't exist. The cultural identification of people descended from the enslaved in America is incredibly important. I just don't think that is written in our DNA, because people identify in all sorts of different ways, and you will have identities which change on a day-to-day basis depending on who's asking that question. Where are you really from is a question that people like me get asked quite a lot throughout the course of their life. And it's also the title of my children's book.
Of course it is, yes. Right, we'll leave that there. Thank you, Tom. Just keep hold of that for a minute, please. Thank you.
Always be closing.
Right, so we are going to change topic. We're going to talk about ethics. I will come to you for a question afterwards, but I do apologise for that. Right, we're going to talk about genealogy ethics now. And one of the most difficult parts of my research was the idea of contacting relatives. I didn't research this in advance. I just went stumbling in. And I just approached people, on the mostly wrong assumption that they would be interested in talking with me, which it was true in a couple of cases that people were interested, but not with the main players, my father in particular and direct siblings. Now, in a couple of cases, I made quite a nuisance of myself to push things forward, to get heard, to get responses in ways that I'm perhaps not particularly happy about, but I was trying to move things forward. This also means that the various family members now know that Peter had an illegitimate child in the 60s during a time when he was most probably courting his first wife, looking at the timeline, right? So, Jonathan, is my father entitled to anonymity in this room? I'm not going to keep treating him as anonymous, but I want to know what your view is. What ethical considerations would I be ignoring by stating his actual name?
You're asking me an ethical question?
Yeah, you seem like a nice guy.
Well, you ask a question that is very hard to answer because, when I was looking up information for this panel and reading the ethical literature on the use of these public genealogy databases, for example, to find murderers, which is another application that sometimes happens, the question that is often raised by ethicists is exactly that. It's like, on the one hand, you've got public protection, and on the other hand, you have individual rights to privacy. And how that is navigated there is no clear, easy answer to this. If I may digress a little bit, there's a story that illustrates this. I was at a conference, and there was a police investigator who was reporting on a very interesting case that they had to deal with, which was a case of sexual assault. They recovered DNA from the victim. They ran it through CODIS, which is the American database to match DNA to known criminals. And there was a match, but the match was to a man who was behind bars at the time of the assault. They were a prisoner, and so they could not have committed this. And she was making the point that the case could have been solved faster had they had access to that man's medical records. Eventually, they did the gumshoe detective work of speaking to that man's relatives, and they found out that he had received a bone marrow transplant from his brother a few years before. And so what happens is your bone marrow makes your blood cells, and so this man was now a genetic chimera. So the DNA in his blood cells was from his brother, and the DNA from all of his other cells was from him. So it was his brother who had committed the sexual assault. So it highlighted this, but the medical records were not, they could not be accessed by the investigators. So it illustrated this tension between, well, we want to protect the public. There's a criminal out there, might strike again, but also there's this our own rights to our medical records and to our medical history. So to come back to your question, there is no clear, easy answer in my mind. There is this ethical tension there, and I'm not sure how to resolve it.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we're going to hear from everybody on this topic, but I just want to introduce a story that you've kind of alluded to there. So when the so-called Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, was arrested for 13 murders and 51 sexual assaults in 2018. It had been 32 years since he last offended, if you don't include the creepy phone calls. They used DNA from crime scenes and, using public DNA resources, identified extremely distant relatives. Then they built out all of those family trees all the way down to present day, and then they started crossing people off the list based on known information. They got it down to 3 men and took covert DNA samples from them, and DeAngelo was found to be the killer. It's amazing. Now, at the time this happened, the DNA owners, people like you and me, who they were hoping to match the sample to and find our relatives, none of us had given permission for that. Do I give you permission to find a murderer in my family? So was it ethical for the police to use public personal data in this way? Adam, let's go to you first, and I'll come to you on the topic.
There's a qualification. The way you told that was more accurate than most people report it, so appreciate that. There is a qualification to this, which is that the GED database that was used, GEDmatch, is voluntary. So this is people who've paid to have their DNA sequence from companies like 23andMe or Ancestry, and then you can get the raw data, and then you can upload it to publicly available databases, and GEDmatch is one of those. So the people who were identified as being relatives of DeAngelo, I think, had done that voluntarily. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yes.
they've updated the terms and conditions because there was such a furore. So
Yeah, that's
in the
right.
last 2 years, you've now got to tick a box to opt in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
And FTDNA.
right.
So there's 2 websites that could utilise your DNA, GEDmatch and FTDNA, but you have to manually tick a box now that you
So
don't mind.
there's a related issue to this, which is less about crime but more about what's 23andMe's stated objective in selling their ancestry and health-related genetic database products, which is that they, like Google, want to curate this data set, which is your genome, right? The ancestry and the health testing is just a sort of byproduct of that, because what they are doing is getting you to pay to give your most private information to a private company that if you opt out of, if you don't opt out of, they then have the right to sell it on, which they do successfully in order to do things like develop drugs, which then get sold back to the punter. It's an it's a genius scheme in many ways.
What bothers me about that is that when they give you the disclaimer for it, they don't say, by the way, this is a commercial proposition. They say, do you opt into medical research?
Yeah.
And I ticked
Yeah.
yes, and I didn't realise when I ticked yes,
Well-
by the way, we're going to sell that data for that purpose.
I'm not in the business of telling people how to spend their money, right?
Yeah.
But I think that you need to go into these things knowing very clearly what it is that that you are becoming, you're paying to become a product. We think that around about last estimates were about 80% of people do not opt out of that. So and now 23andMe has the biggest genome database of any establishment. Yeah.
Well, I think that none of us read the terms and conditions. I got a new dishwasher this week and there were 12 pages of instructions and I thought, don't you just press that button? So none of us read terms and conditions, and what I hadn't understood, which I do now, is when I first did a DNA test, my children were fascinated with this Irish angle and how Jamaican they were, brackets, Nigerian. And basically one of my sons, on reflection, has asked to have his DNA removed. But what...
Oh, from the database?
Yeah.
Well, it's a big hypodermic. What?
We're back to those zombie things.
that's not
on
gonna
the
work.
zombie.
Magic wand with some mist coming from it. What?
Anyway, the point is, he can have his DNA removed online as much as he likes. Mine is sitting there,
Yeah.
and he's half of my child. So I mathematically, because I'm philosophy and psychology, I hadn't understood that he can demand his DNA to be removed as much as he likes, but mine is sitting there, and he's half of me. So it wouldn't take a genius to do much playing around.
That's right.
with
It
that
doesn't
information.
just in case you haven't done this, it doesn't take a lot of work to reveal hidden data either.
No.
So the sites by default, they don't publish even if you've made your family tree public, they don't publish the names of people who are indicated
Who are
in your tree as
alive.
being alive. But it's actually not very difficult by association to find many people in public records who haven't opted in.
90% find a third cousin or closer.
Yeah.
Third cousin or closer. So you're
Significant.
really...
3 generations up.
Yeah. So you've got your common ancestor is
I
great
found a first cousin. I got a notification a
No,
couple
but
of
the
weeks ago.
average person.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
I found a first cousin
Never heard of this
recently.
person before.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm not that interested, to be honest. I've got loads of first
I
cousins
think you and
already.
Jonathan are going for a drink later.
Why are you frequenting that one?
Well, she lives in Canada.
She must
So
be
what?
adopted.
Geographically, that's a long way to go to meet someone.
I made it.
You could
Fanny,
assume.
Fanny, question for you, please. In your book, Ethical Dilemmas in Genealogy, you consider some of the wider ethical issues. So I'm going to give a couple of examples. For example, say a mother abandons a child, if that's the correct word for that, I don't know, outside a police station in the 60s. She's since created an entirely new family. She's never uttered a word about it to anyone. And in 2022, that foundling child works out who their mother is because one of the mother's new family decide to do a DNA test. Or alternatively, your own situation with adoptees looking for their biological parents. So what are the ethical considerations for individuals when they're pursuing these kinds of answers where there's lots of third parties involved who might have some skin in the game?
Well, I think a couple of as an aside, the term foundling and even the term adoptee give me little hairs, because I was adopted. I don't feel like an adoptee. So somebody might not be a diabetic, they've got diabetes. So foundling is such a horrible word, and we use it. Anyway, I've tried, to me, language is power. So basically, for a million reasons, that poor girl might have had to leave her baby somewhere, and to leave the baby in a phone box, a police station, or the hospital, that's showing an altruistic side. It's not been left under a tree in the middle of nowhere. So basically, most people are going to be distraught. You don't just wake up and think, oh, I'll just leave my baby somewhere. Well, until they're teenagers, but basically, some of the stupid things that I did as a young person, and now I'm just not any taller, obviously, but much more mature. You can't go back to that situation. When you go back to that situation, that person must have been distraught.
Indeed.
So therefore, you have to understand poverty. Person could have been raped. Maybe the father, the girl's father was overbearing. Maybe it was bringing shame on the family or for religion. So some girls were forced into giving up their baby, and we've got hideous stories coming out of Ireland where the girl is in one room in a mother and baby home, and oh, sorry, your baby died, and in the next room being sold. So hideous stories going on. So as far as I'm concerned, I've got the right to know who my biological parents were.
Right, I've had a number of people say that to me as well, yeah.
But I haven't got the right to disrupt anybody's life or relationship or be horrible. And with rights go responsibilities. So if you meet your biological family, it's a whole new relationship. You can't just be mother and baby, because you're middle-aged and they're elderly, or you've lost that baby relationship. So you have to really tread carefully. And I've sent some real boo-boo messages through the messaging systems. Hi, I'm adopted, I'm really nice. Block. I didn't know you could
just to anybody you could message, or to family members, or are you choosy about who you send these messages?
I didn't know you could block people on these websites, because I think I'm really nice. What problem? What's the problem? But you are the physical embodiment of somebody else's secret, and maybe the person got raped. Maybe it was incest. So
there are ethical considerations, and one should tread carefully.
Diplomacy is the key, and you have to really remember this person had a different size and shape and personality and lifestyle then, and if you were the first baby, you can be very disruptive as well, because if you were the first baby, that person might have gone on to get married and have more children. So suddenly you're in different hierarchies and pecking orders. And on occasions, some people might be worried about money issues.
Yeah, okay, that's fine, thank you. We're going to move on from the ethics side. So, Britt, how's your question doing?
Still there.
Okay, Tom, can we get the catch box over there?
I'll keep it. Oh, is it on?
Yeah.
I'll keep it brief.
Is this thing on?
I just want to know your opinion on using these tests for personal gain. So information that you find to then use on an application, or in some way that benefits you, perhaps health insurance, perhaps college education applications.
Jonathan, do you want to speak to that?
Do you have a specific application in mind? A specific advantage that you would write there?
What type of commercial activity are you talking about?
In the US, if you click ethnicity boxes, there's sometimes different admission selectivity criteria is one example.
But genetics doesn't relate to that. So.
No. But if you have a piece of paper that says perhaps you have ancestry with a Native American, ancestry, so you can click the Native American box.
Okay, so in the Federation of Indigenous People in America does not allow genetic identification for tribal membership. They use a 19th century construction which was invented by colonizers which is called blood quanta, and it's basically a representation of how many ancestors you have that can identify as belonging to that specific tribe. With one exception, which is for the DNA can be used for the identification of immediate siblings or parents, right? So that isn't allowed. I think it's a really big problem in America because there are loads of services, one of which tried to sue me unsuccessfully, who do specifically target people to spin a tube, you send it off, and they'll tell you which tribe you're a member of, right? That's an impossibility. It's an impossibility scientifically, but also culturally and historically for multiple reasons. This is a source of great antagonism in terms of the relationship between Western science and indigenous peoples all around the world, because it feeds into an ongoing narrative of persecution. And also, it's one of the reasons why we know so little about indigenous peoples' DNA, because if they think that their reparation settlements might be removed if they turn out, they do a DNA test and it turns out they're not a member of this tribe or this tribe, which is quite possible because what happened in things like the Trail of Tears under Andrew Jackson is that people are forcibly moved from one part of the country to another. And in many of the indigenous cultures in America, there aren't very strong, robust written records. A lot of it is narrative driven. And what that means is that, oh God, maybe it turns out I'm not Catawba, maybe we were moved and actually I'm Dakota, right? And therefore, am I still entitled to those reparations? So that particular example is a massively multi-tiered shit sandwich, and it's appalling. It's appalling. But these are the types of things we're having to wrangle with because unscrupulous peoples are very willing to use this new technology for commercial gain by selling narratives which are scientifically and historically inaccurate.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Thank you. We're close to wrapping up, but I do want to touch on one more topic before we finish, which is actually the main reason Jonathan's on the panel. And I want to ask you, Jonathan, can my DNA test tell me what I should be eating?
So I was planning on speaking for like 10 minutes, and I have about 10 seconds, right?
You have just over 2 minutes.
Great. Okay, so here's Cliff's notes on all of this, because there are DNA tests for nutrigenomics, right? This is what you should be eating given your genetic profile. Health testing, carrier status, risk factors, drug response, somatic traits. Do I have a unibrow? You can pay money to learn if you have a unibrow, or you could buy a mirror.
Less expensive, yeah.
Which is cheaper. Look, the epigenetic clocks, right? So how old are you really? How old are your genes? Well, let's look at the marks on your genes that turn genes on and off. Dating, compatibility. Couples can spit into cups and then send them out. And you're an explorer because of your serotonin genotype. So all of these kits are out there. And what I want to say is that I've been putting other people's words in my mouth today. I've mentioned genetic astrology. I'm going to mention science exploitation, which was coined by Timothy Caulfield, which is the exploitation of preliminary results of emerging fields of study and their rapid commercialization when they're not ready for prime time. And I think that science exploitation applies to a lot of these direct-to-consumer genetic tests. And perhaps the last thing that so ask yourself, what will I do with the information that I get from these kids? What am I ready to do? Because we know that health behavior change is very hard to do. Can I get the same useful information without paying £100? Can I learn to stop smoking, to drink less alcohol, to start exercising more? You don't need an expensive genetic test to be told that. And to your point about nutrigenomics, I want to give the last word to the dearly departed Dr. Cecil Janssens. She was a well-known epidemiologist. She died a month ago. I was reading a report from a nutrigenomics workshop that took place in 2017, and she was there in attendance. And it was a very bizarre workshop where different groups were trying to figure out what is the state of nutrigenomics, or of telling people what to eat based on their DNA. And there was this idea of at some point we might be able to commercialize meal plans, right? So if you subscribe to meal plan kits where you get them and you start cooking with them, now you could get them based on your genetic profile. So there's a lot of money to be made there. And there's epidemiologist Cecil Janssens towards the end of the workshop saying, publicly, it's in the record, I'm sure that when I walk out of the building here later and I see the people on the street, that I'll question myself. What have I been doing this entire day? Why have I not tried to solve a bigger problem for them instead of trying to find a little benefit in nutrigenomics?
Very good. And we'll take that as the last word. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks to my amazing panel, Adam, Penny, Jonathan. Thank you for coming to our panel. I had a whole nother section we didn't get to. We appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of QED. Cheers.